All right, now we're ready to get started with chapter 19, and we'll be examining the cardiovascular system, but this time we'll be focusing on the heart. The heart's found immediately behind the sternum. It's situated between the lungs and within what we call the mediastinum, which also holds the great vessels. And those great vessels, for those that are unfamiliar, are the thymus, the esophagus, and the trachea. The heart's about the size of a clenched fist, as you guys can see here. It's shaped like an inverted cone with the pointed apex oriented down and the broad flat base oriented up. You can see those both here. A typical adult heart measures about 5 inches, or measuring from the base to the apex. So let's look at some more of the anatomy here. When we're looking at the heart from this view, we can see where the heart's located within the thoracic cavity. A mid-sagittal section through the trunk does not divide the heart into 2 equal halves because the center lies slightly to the left of the midline. So when we do the Pledge of Allegiance, we place our hand on our upper left chest. And we do that probably over a little bit more from where the heart really is, but that's our reminder that the heart is slightly away from the midline, moving toward the left. So we can say that it's pointed toward the left rib cage and the base points toward the right shoulder. The entire heart is also rotated so that the right atrium and right ventricle dominate the anterior view. Okay, so here's another look at the normal heart in a chest x-ray. That's the abbreviation there, capital C, lowercase x, lowercase r for chest x-ray. And this even has the different parts of the heart, which we're going to learn about, marked off. And this is an angiogram of the heart. So the anterior view of the heart also illustrates its borders, as we can see. The base forms the superior border. The right border of the heart is formed by the right atrium. The left border of the heart is formed by the left ventricle and a small portion of the left atrium. The inferior border is formed mainly by the inferior wall of the right ventricle. In this chapter, we're also going to relate the heart anatomy to the physiology of the heart. And you can see that some of the physiology that we'll talk about is located right in the EKG, also known as ECG, right in this picture here. So if the heart should stop, we can perform what we call CPR, or cardiopulmonary resuscitation, to maintain the flow of the blood until the heart resumes beating. And you can see here, this person is performing CPR by placing the hands on the center of the chest, the lower part of the breastbone. And you can see that is located between T4 and T9 on the vertebral column. By applying the pressure to the sternum, the blood within the heart will be squeezed out of the heart and into the circulation. So here you can see the chambers of the heart and the circulation through the heart. So we'll be talking about this entire process, and this is a core competency of the course. I always like to teach students that the best way to remember this is what we're going to discuss goes from the heart to the lungs, back to the heart, and then back to the body. And then to the heart, and then to the lungs, and then to the heart, and back to the body. So if you can remember that, that will help you with the sequence that we're going to be discussing when it comes to circulation. So blood flows from the right atrium to the right ventricle via what we call the right atrioventricular valve. or it's also known as the tricuspid valve. And from the right ventricle enters the pulmonary artery on its way to the pulmonary circuit to become pre-oxygenated. And then it comes back to the heart into the left atrium via the pulmonary veins and goes from the left atrium through the left atrioventricular valve, which is known as the bicuspid or mitral valve, and then into the left ventricle. From there, it goes into the aorta. And that's where it goes to the rest of the body. So here you can see the pericardial membranes and the layers around the heart. The heart wall contains a total of 3 layers. We have the endocardium, which is the inner surfaces of the heart, including those of the heart valves, which are covered by the endocardium as well. And this is a simple squamous epithelium. And we learned about that in AMP1. And there's also an underlying, what we call areolar tissue. And then the squamous epithelial lining of the cardiovascular system is called the endothelium, right? So it's in the endocardium. Now, the endothelium of the heart is continuous with the endothelium of the attached great vessels. And then we have the myocardium, which is the muscular wall. We know that myo means muscle. So it's the muscular wall of the heart. And it forms both the atria and the ventricles. And so this is a middle layer, and it contains the concentric layers of cardiac muscle tissue, as well as blood vessels and nerves. The atrial myocardium contains muscle bundles that wrap around the atrium and form a figure 8. And that figure 8 encircles the great vessels. Then the superficial ventricular muscles wrap around both ventricles, while the deeper muscle layers spiral around between the ventricles toward the apex. And that's the figure 8 pattern. Then we have the epicardium, also known as the visceral layer of the serous pericardium, which covers the outer surface of the heart. So this is the serous membrane that we talked about in AMP1. Some people pronounce it serous membrane. And it consists of an exposed mesothelium and an underlying layer of areolar connective tissue that is attached to the myocardium. The heart's also surrounded by several membranes: the fibrous pericardium, which is a tough, loose-fitting outer membrane; the serous or serous pericardium, which is a double-layered inner serous membrane, which consists of a parietal layer. And that is the outer layer of the serous pericardium. And then the visceral layer, which is the inner layer and is equivalent to the epicardium, which also serves as the outer wall of the heart. And then between the parietal and visceral layers of the serous pericardium is a space called the pericardial cavity, and it contains pericardial fluid. So on each beat of the heart is going to change its size and shape, right, as this all is occurring. So the pericardial cavity commits these changes, and the slippery pericardial lining prevents friction between the heart and the structures that are surrounding it, the adjacent structures. So this relationship between the heart and the pericardial cavity resembles that of a fist pushing into a balloon. All right, so the wrist corresponds to the base of the heart, and the balloon corresponds to the lining of the pericardial cavity. And that's another picture we saw in the book in AMP1, and that's really like the true meaning of that picture that we saw with like the fist inside the heart there. So cardiac tamponade or tamponade, I've also seen it pronounced, is shown here. And this is when fluid builds up in the pericardial cavity surrounding the heart. Now here's where we can see the external anatomy of the heart, and we can also see many of the vessels that serve the heart. There are 2 upper chambers of the heart. We call those the atrium right? We have the right and left atria. And then we have two lower pumping chambers, which we call the ventricles. And we have the left and right ventricle. Okay, so you can see those in those pictures off to the right there, anterior view and posterior view, among the many other parts. So back to the atriums real quick. Each atrium possesses an outer expandable extension called an auricle. And the atria are separated by an inner wall called an inner atrial septum. All right, so that's the septum that separates the atria. The right atrium is a shallow depression called the fossa alveolus, which marks the location of the former hull, and the interatrial septum called the foramen ovule, which is present during embryonic development. The anterior wall and the inner surface of the auricle contains specialized myocardial ridges called pectinate muscles. And the right atrium receives deoxygenated blood from the body, while the left atrium receives oxygenated blood from the lungs. Remember, we're going heart to lungs to heart to body, and then heart to lungs to heart to body. The right and left ventricles now are separated by a thick partition called the interventricular septum. So there's another septum. The right ventricle is relatively thin-walled, resembling a pouch attached to the massive wall of the left ventricle. So this thin wall is adequate, actually, because the right ventricle only needs to pump blood out to the lungs. All right, and that's the point where they go heart to lung. And that's the pulmonary circuit. The left ventricle is 3 times more muscular than the right ventricle and is round in cross-section. So it develops more pressure to pump blood around the body. The systemic circuit is what we call that. And the inner surfaces of the ventricles possess a series of large irregular muscular ridges called trabeculae carnae. So here you can see a different view of what we were discussing. So the muscles and the heart layers that we spoke about. And in this view, you can see the difference in the right ventricle versus the left ventricle. And you can see that the myometrium in the left ventricle is significantly thicker than that of the right ventricle. So now that we've talked about the external anatomy, let's talk about the internal anatomy of the heart, which is shown here. So you can see the fossa alveolus. You can see the pectinate muscles. You can see the trabeculae carnae, as well as the interventricular septum that I just spoke about. Okay, so definitely look here and try to find those here in the list and look at where they're located. So the valves of the heart are also shown here. We have the atrioventricular valves, also called the AV valves. A lot of textbooks will just abbreviate them AV. And in the medical field, a lot of times we abbreviate them AV. And they separate each atrium from the corresponding ventricle. So the free ridge of each valve consists of 2 or more flaps called cusps. And the cusps basically are attached to the tendinous connective tissue, which are fibers, essentially. And these fibers are going to originate at the muscular projections of the heart called the papillary muscles. So basically, these muscles and the choroid tendinae basically work together to prevent inversion of this AV valve that we just spoke about during the contraction of the heart. Because if we had inversion, we'd have what we call backflow, and that would be a problem. So there are actually 2 types of AV valves. We have the tricuspid, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, which by our prefix, we know that it has 3 cusps. And that tricuspid allows the flow of the blood from the right atrium to go to the right ventricle. But again, it prevents the backflow during the ventricular contraction. And then the other valve there is the bicuspid, which we just said was a few minutes ago is called the mitral valve. And that possesses, by bicuspid, we know it's two cusps, and it allows the blood to flow, again, but this time from the left atrium to the left ventricle. But once again, it prevents backflow during the ventricular contractions. Then we have something called the semilunar valve, which separates each ventricle from the vessels that exit them. All right, so this valve is made of 3 crescent-shaped or pocket-like cusps. And there are also 2 types of semilunar valves. We have the pulmonary and we have the aortic. All right, so here are the AV valves and the semilunar valves, and a little more information about each. So here's a look at the valves of the heart a little further during relaxation. So the ventricles contract, blood moving back toward the atria, push the cusps of the AV valve together, closing them, and again, we prevent black flow. At the same time, the contraction of the papillary muscles tense, and that stops the cusps before they invert. So as the pressure within the vesicles rises above that in pulmonary and systemic circuits, the semilunar valves will open and the blood's ejected out of the ventricles and into the corresponding blood vessels. So then there's also some embedded links, which you can see. So let's look more at the valves of the heart. You can look at the heart sounds animation. You can look at the heart echocardiogram. And on the previous slide here, we had a heart valve video. So here you can see more about the support involving the AV valve. This is the dissection here. You can see those structures that we were alluding to. So this is a frontal section here. You can see the papillary muscles attached to the tricuspid valve, as you can see at the bottom caption. Now, this is the coronary circuit that is shown here. So we previously mentioned the blood flow through the chambers of the heart. The pulmonary circuit is where the deoxygenated blood from the body flows into the right atrium via the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus. And the pulmonary circuit will continue into the pulmonary trunk, which branches into the right and left pulmonary arteries, transporting the deoxygenated blood to the lungs where it picks up oxygen. The systemic circuit is where oxygenated blood leaves the lungs by traveling in the left and right pulmonary veins into the left atrium, goes into the left ventricle, and then out of the left ventricle via the aortic valve. Into the aorta, and as we said a few minutes ago, then out into the body. And then finally here we have the coronary circuit. While most of the oxygenated blood ejected into the aorta flows out to the body, some of it is transported to the walls of the heart. And at the base of the aorta are 2 branches. We have the right coronary artery, which sits in the coronary sulcus around the heart and supplies blood to the right atrium portions of both ventricles and portions of the conducting system of the heart. It actually has 2 branches that are of some significant importance. We have the marginal arteries and the posterior interventricular artery. The left coronary artery supplies blood to the left ventricle, left atrium, and interventricular septum. And it has 2 branches, the anterior interventricular artery and circumflex artery. So here's where we get some venous return. What happens is once the blood drops off oxygen to the walls of the heart, it must return to the heart chambers. So the return occurs through the veins. And so we call this venous for veins, venous return. So there are several veins that I just want to mention. We have the small cardiac vein, which runs parallel to the marginal arteries in the right coronary artery. We have the middle cardiac vein, which runs essentially parallel to the posterior interventricular artery. And then we have what we call the great cardiac vein. And that one runs parallel to the anterior intraventricular artery and the circumflex artery that we just mentioned. So all 3 basically merge to form the coronary sinus, which is going to drain into the right atrium along with the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. So here you can see what happens when the coronary arteries become occluded or blocked. Okay, so this is what we call when we have an artery blockage. That blockage can lead to reduction of blood flow, and then it can lead to death of the cardiac tissue if it's not corrected. So it can be pretty serious. That actually concludes part 1 of our chapter 19 lecture, and I'll pick back up with the part 2 chapter 19 video.